Well, good afternoon. Welcome to VirtuAg's webinar for today, Ag Decisions, Gaining Insights to Improve Risk Management, Profit and Productivity. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ed Gannon. I'm editor of the Weekly Times. I'm also editor-in-chief of News Corp Rural. So joining on today's panel, we've got Cam Nicholson from Nikon Rural Services, who's a consultant and also a beef and sheep producer himself. We've got Jason Shields, who's the orchard manager at Plunkett Orchards at Ardmona, and he's also currently the Weekly Times Coles Horticulture Farmer of the Year. And we've got Graham Phelps, who's manager of agriculture practice at WorkSafe Victoria. So welcome, gentlemen. Now, before we get underway, I'd like to go a little bit of housekeeping. There's time for questions in the latter half of the webinar. There's a web chat. You can submit a question at any point as we go along, and with time permitting and questions permitting, we'll get to those and read them out. And also, too, the webinar is being recorded today, so we'll share a link with you and after the event's complete, and you can share that with your colleagues. So, also like to acknowledge our gold partner for VirtuAg, the Commonwealth Bank, and also to WorkSafe Victoria, who is the sponsor of this webinar. So let's get underway. Structure of the day: each of our speakers will just have about 6 minutes or so to talk about what their decision making, and then we'll have a discussion and then questions after that. So first, we'll kick off with you, Cam. Webinar is all about decisions. You're perfectly placed. You're an observer of many farm businesses as well as running your own. Tell us about your philosophy about good decision making on farms.
Yeah, I suppose my philosophy is built on not only our own application on our farm, but people I've observed in the 30 years that I've been consulting. And I mean, what strikes me is, for me, the best farm managers aren't ones that necessarily have more land, greater equity, get greater rainfall. What they have in common is they make good decisions at the right time. And I think that's a really important sort of just understanding. What's separating them out is actually that decision-making process. And I've been fascinated, particularly in the last 15 years, in trying to understand that a little bit better. And they have a process that they go through, which I think is something that I've realised now that other people can learn. You can understand that, you can learn it, you can become more confident at doing that and making those sort of decisions. And look, it might sound a bit odd, but I ask this to a lot of people: when were you actually taught how to make a good decision in the same way that you were sort of taught to read and write? I can remember at school being taught for years and years and years and progressively getting better at reading and writing. But I don't remember being taught a process of decision making that built from when I was very young to where I am now. So a lot of that stuff I think you learn on the job. And I suppose what I've concluded is that you can actually become better as a decision maker if you can understand the process and follow a few steps. The key elements that I reckon that make a really good decision, and there's probably four that I want to cover. The first one is, rarely in a decision, particularly if there's some complexity about it, is there only one or two factors to consider. So quite often there'll be half a dozen, maybe 8 different factors that you need to think about. And importantly, each of those factors have different relative importance to each other. So some of them may be more important, but it doesn't mean some of the others aren't important as well. They just may not carry as much weight when you're finally trying to come to that conclusion or make that decision. The second one is that some of those critical factors are what I call the pros and cons of a decision. Rarely do all the critical factors stack up in your favour. But usually we've got to make decisions on balance. So there are some things on the pro side which are positive, and there are some things on the con side which are negative. And in making good decisions, I see the best farmers that make those good decisions are ones that balance up those pros and cons and then say, on balance, this is a good thing to be able to do. So I think that's important. It's important also including risk into that consideration of that decision. And risk is a very personal thing, and it changes depending on your circumstance, stage of life, things like that. So I've had clients that I've worked with now for nearly 30 years. When I first started, they were had a higher risk appetite than what they do, 20 years later, 25 years later, when they might be towards the end of their career. So that decision changes, the amount of risk you want to take on changes as your circumstance changes. And the last thing, though, I think this is really important, is in any good decision, in my mind, it's got to include what I call the head, heart and gut. The head being the facts, the heart being your values, your beliefs, your preferences, and your gut being your experience and your intuition. And I think all of those have got to be, those elements have to be in there. We try practicing that on our farm and trying to use that process to help us in our decision making. Where we are on the Bellarine Peninsula, we run a very high stocking rate, which is fantastic in good years like we're having down south. But in tight years, you hit the wall really quickly. So our decision making's got to be pretty spot on so that we don't run ourselves into the ground too early. And maybe the best way of showing what I'm talking about is just if we can pop up an example, I think we might have here, of this is what I call our decision process. And just to run through it really quickly with you, first of all, the first line is defining the decision. And this example I've got here is that in early mid-September each year, we go through and decide whether we adjust our stock numbers to take us through spring and summer. Might seem odd, that's the start of spring. Everybody, you get a flush of growth in spring. Why would you think about it then? For us, that's the time to make those good early and timely decisions. Next thing we do is then we identify the critical factors, which are the columns on the left. So you'll see in part of that decision, we have these 6, 7 critical factors that we need to weigh up. In each of those critical factors, we consider different things where we start to think differently about that decision. So if I look at the first example, which is current feed supply, I think differently, or we think differently about a decision if we've got greater than 2,000 kilos of feed in mid-September than if we've got less than 1,500. But that's only one component of it. And you'll see for each of those critical factors, we have these different points where we start to think differently. To pick up that idea of relative weighting, I've got the scores in that third column on the right-hand side. And you can see there the score we put on having greater than 2,000 kilos of feed with a score of 6. We rate that as more important or a relative weighting higher than what we might have on the seasonal forecast, which the best seasonal forecast we give would be a 4. So we score each of those. And down the bottom, then we have our what we call our decision points. And if they get above or below certain scores, that helps us guide the decision that we're going to make. And we've thought through this before we're in the thick of having to make that decision. We've thought through that well in advance. And I've just got 2 examples there on the right-hand side. One is how we fared in 2018 when we ended up with a decile 2 growing season year. And so 1st of September, we ran through this process, and that's how the score was. It got a score of 11. And so the decision there was to move stock on as soon as possible. So we moved all our steers on very early, booked them into the feedlot early. And what was interesting, when most people then thought, gee, I've run out of feed, I've got to get rid of these stock, all the feedlots were full. So that early decision making allowed us to move stock on at a reasonable price and actually move them off the business and make that good early decision where we couldn't have otherwise. In contrast, 2020, which is the year we're going through at the moment, we're actually cutting more hay than we've ever done before, just because the way the season's stacking up, we've scored 21 this year compared to 2018. And just 2 other things I'll say quickly, Ed, just to finish off. What's important with this is it allows us to concentrate on the skills and information that we need and get rid of all the noise. I think one of the real challenges we've got in ag at the moment is there's lots of information out there coming from lots of different sources, and you've got to make sure you only focus on the things that are important in making a decision and not getting confused, I suppose, by too much information. And the second bit of that is then you also know what skills you need. So I know we need to have good skills at measuring, say, feed on offer, so I can work out how many kilos of dry matter I've got. We put a moisture probe in so we know how much moisture is in the soil and so on. So it helps us focus on those things, which I think helps us make good decisions. And when I look at the good farmers, it's exactly what they do. And on that note, Ed, I think I'll pull up.
Thanks, Cam. Look, some really great stuff there. I mean, and really good stuff that will probably provoke some questions from the audience as well. So we'll hopefully we'll get back to some of those things. Jason, to you, your job, you're a manager of an orchard. You're making decisions all the time. Take us through the sort of stuff that you do and your philosophy on where you're decision making.
Thanks, Ed. So we're based in the Goulburn Valley. We're a 100-year-old business. We're the 4th generation now. So if you sort of go back about 20 years ago when I started here, which is when Andrew, the son, who's the general manager, Andrew Plunkett, come back. We had one property and we were about 180, 150 acres in size. And, over the last 20 years, we've grown to 4 properties and, at about 550 acres. So we've had a lot of confidence in the industry, but probably our main focus, I'd say, for the last 10 to 15 years is coming up with systems in the orchard and in the shed, to be able to utilise technology to, I like to say, to future-proof our business going forward. So being a horticultural business, our biggest risk, although climate and everything is a risk, I think labour is our biggest risk. We're a very high input labour component to our business. Like, we probably 75 to 80% of our expense has all been around labour. So this year's been a little bit funny. Like, I would sort of say in the last, couple of years, I keep saying this thing's coming, this labour, we always have a lot of meetings and stuff, and, and everyone's complaining about labour, and they're always complaining they can't get it, but I never really hear any solutions of what they're going to do about it, except to complain that the government needs to do something to get us labour. So we've taken a pretty big approach to, future-proofing our business. So we like to say that, we're not reliant on anything. So we're not reliant on Pacific Islander scheme. We're not reliant on backpackers. We're not reliant on anything. We've tried to create a system, whether that's a growing system or a packing system, that is simple, so anyone can do it. It's easy, so it's not physically hard like in the days where we had to be strong workers with picking bags and ladders and all this stuff. It's safer, but by doing all that, we open up our source of labour. Like, I kind of say we kind of have an unlimited labour source out there. So this year, though, like I keep saying that this is what's going to happen, I think, in the last 6 months after this virus, the backpackers are going to come short. The Pacific Islanders are going to find it harder to come in. So it's kind of, I think, what we have planned for has come to fruition, probably a little bit faster than what we planned in the initial part. So I think growing fruit is, if you had 10 trees and you only had to grow the fruit yourself, fruit grows on trees. It's not that hard. I think the hardest part of it, it's more as, on our sort of size scale, I feel more like a HR manager than I do an actual fruit growing manager. So it's all about managing the risks of being able to, utilise labour, get labour, make labour efficient. We've come up with systems, and since we've come up with growing systems that are simple, we've been able to then implement technologies like picking platforms, and those platforms we can thin and prune and everything on. So kind of in the past, where we would have groups of 20 people working, and they'd all have a ladder, and we'd have 20 rows in a block, and we'd have one person in every row. We would have a decision on that block once everyone finished the row. The block was finished, and then we go, oh, we didn't do it right. But now we by using the technologies, we've got 6 people on a platform, so those people we finish one row, and we can make something change before we finish the block. We use some of our software packages that we do our costings and that, and we can, after 1 hour, we know if we're on track for the rest of the block, rather than finishing the block and then saying we did it wrong. So it's all sort of stuff like that. The other thing that I have found that we have, that we've really tried to focus on is consistency. The supermarkets, the consumers, everyone wants, and so they should, they want a better, more consistent piece of fruit. We want them to have a good experience. And that's really hard when you have 20 different people all picking into one bin each. So you've got 20 different selections going into one. When we're on our packing line, we have 20 packers, and we have 20 packers making a different decision for each box. So the way that we've done it is using the new pack house facility that we've just put into place, and with the pickers, it's now we have 6 people packing into one bin, 6 people packing into one box. So the consistency is, instead of being 20 different bins, we have 3 different bins, but with 6 people into each bin. So we can make a change after 3 bins are picked rather than 20 bins being picked, and they've all picked one bin and there's a mistake. We picked that up rather than in 3 hours time, we picked that up in 15 minutes. But so it's just all about, utilising labour, making labour attractive. In the last 10 years, I haven't had anyone leave. Well, very rarely we have anyone leave. And in the last 3 weeks, I've had 10 workers leave and they're working on platforms. So I can just, our last probably 48 hours that we've spent is just, wow, what's happening? What are we going to do? How are we going to, we can see what's coming in another 3 months' time because the backpackers aren't there. And, they're all leaving to go to factory jobs, which they probably would have never had an opportunity to get, like it's in a soap factory or something like that, because there was so much competition. So, we have to be proactive to give these guys a good experience, a good job, pay them a good hourly rate, good working conditions. So, it's in our horticultural business. That's the way forward that I believe.
Thanks, Jason. Look, and the coronavirus has obviously thrown a lot of the decision making is intensified that, so which is really interesting. We might get back to that a bit later on. Graham, at the end of the day, decisions on farms, it's irrelevant if safety's not there and you don't come home from a day's work at the end of the day. Just what your the sort of things in your role that you're seeing and the sorts of issues and around that decision-making component that people are having.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And you're spot on. This is a webinar about productivity and performance on farms, and you're spot on. An injury or worse, a fatality on your farm is going to really upset your productivity more than almost any other issue you can run into. So we believe that good decision making around safety is kind of fundamental for farm success. Unfortunately, agriculture in Victoria, 2% of the workforce works in agriculture, but 30% of the workplace deaths occur on farms. And that tells us that whilst farmers have been really good at focusing on productivity and managing risk and improving productivity in Victoria over the last decades, we're not putting enough focus on our decision-making around safety. Otherwise, we wouldn't, you're 15 times more likely to be killed if you're a farm worker than an average worker in Victoria. And that's an awful statistic, and we shouldn't have that. It was really interesting to hear what Cam and Jason were saying, because whilst we don't think there's enough attention paid to, and the stats will tell us there's not enough attention paid to safety decision-making, the process is exactly the same as what the decisions are made around productivity. So Cam talked about making it deliberate, good farmers making good decisions at the right time of the year, and it's exactly the same in safety. That ability that sitting down, looking at the risk. Jason had a look and said, well, what was the biggest risk on my farm at the moment? And it's labour. And so he thought about it, he identified the risk, he made a plan, and he implemented it to manage that risk. And that's exactly the same sort of process we're talking about when making decisions around farm safety. It's not rocket science. It's not something that farmers aren't really good at. Farmers are really good at thinking their way through risk. Making decisions is what they have to do all the time. For some reason, though, we're really concerned with that fatality rate and the injury rate that sits underneath that there's not enough time spent making decisions around safety. And so what do you need to do? You need to do exactly what Cam said. Set some time aside, have a think about your business, do it at least every year, identify what your greatest safety risks are, and I'll bet every farmer online would be able to tell you. If we said, what's your biggest safety risk on farm, every farmer would be able to tell you for sure. And so they know what the safety risk is, have a look at it. What can you do to shift that? What can you do to change it? If you don't know, there's experts out there that can help you. The industry associations have got a whole bunch of information. WorkSafe, there's consultants like OHS Essentials, which will come out to your farm which is a WorkSafe program. So get the experts in, get the equivalent of the agronomists in. Do what you do in productivity. Talk to your neighbours, talk to your family, talk to your workers. How do we manage this? Make a plan, write it down, and get on with it. I think the one slight difference in safety decision-making that's a bit different from, and it's probably only slightly different from decision-making around production, is that there's those big planned decisions you've got to make, but there's also in safety, you're making decisions multiple times every day around safety. Do I put the helmet on to jump on the motorbike to zip out to the back paddock or not? Do I turn the tractor off when I climb out to open a gate, or do I leave it running? Those decisions, and they are often as small as that, they're life and death. That's how people get killed on farms. Really simple, small decisions can be the matter of life and death, but you can also manage that and reduce the impact of those small decisions with those longer term big decisions. So decisions to put OPDs on your quad bikes make your quad bikes safer, and they're safer forever then. So we really think that, you know, your biggest impact on productivity, let alone the impact on your family, on your family situation, on your community, you make bad decisions around safety, have some bad outcomes around safety, and your farm productivity is going to cop a hammering, and your family's going to cop a hammering, and your community's going to cop a hammering. And we think that with good decision making, there's 80 farmers have died over the last 10 years on farms. Every one of those people should still be alive with good decision making. And we believe that fatalities on farms are absolutely preventable with good decision making. So we really are hoping that we can lift the quality of that decision making to the sort of quality that you're seeing in production that you've just heard from Cam and Jason.
Thanks, Graham. Now, Cam, you were nodding your head as Graham was talking. You know, you've gone through your decision-making list there, but are you seeing the sorts of, you know, your observations of farmers? Is they taking safety into account in the way that Graham says perhaps they should?
Yes, and some. It's almost like the discipline of decision making. The same discipline applies in how you apply the safety message. If I split it up, and Graham touched on it, some of them are strategic type stuff. You know, we get someone in, we make a decision to get someone in to assess our wool shed. Do we have the auto stop buttons? Do we have this, that? Do we have all those other bits and pieces in place? And that's a sort of strategic thing that may take a bit of capital investment, but once you get it right, it's right for good. And as long as people know how to use those various things, you can, they're there for good. The other one, though, is exactly like Graham said. It's that short-term stuff of, do I bother putting the helmet on when I ride the quad bike? I'm not going fast, so I won't bother this time because I'm not going a long distance. You know, it's the discipline of saying, that's what I've got to do, that's what I've got to do. And I always see the safety stuff's a bit like good sporting teams. Or good people that are, you know, excel at anything. They generally have that routine and they don't cut corners. That's what makes them good. And so to me, the flip side of that in a safety point of view is if you don't want any of these accidents or deaths or whatever else, you've got to pay attention to that little detail. That's just a critical part of it.
Jason, I mean, one of the things you were talking about before was the decision making sort of on the go. When we got to the end of the row and you sort of made, in the olden days, you'd make the decision at the end. Now you're deciding at the time. Tell us a little bit more about that and you know, and your role, as you explained to me about, as you said before, about you feel like a HR manager rather than actually a farmer nowadays.
Yeah. So like as I said, in the past, we'd always we would have 20 workers and they would have one row each. And there might be 20 rows in a block and you've got 20 rows of being thinned different, 20 rows of being pruned different, 20 rows of being picked different. And by the time they all got to the end of the row, because it was all over, where now by grouping these people up, so a good example is we used to have one person used to go and just bin ticket bins, and it would cost us about $1 a bin because they would walk, 10 Ks a day just walking to a bin, up and down rows to a bin. Now we have brought everyone into little teams of 6, and we have the 3 platforms of 6 people all side by side. So within 15 metres, we have those 20 people. So now instead of that supervisor being a walker, and I called him a bin ticketer, he is actually a supervisor. He is actually able to QC and see every single piece of fruit that they pick, see every single thing that they prune, all from from that one spot. So we have created a lot of efficiencies, and then it's really easy now. Because we say, this block's going to take us 100 hours to prune. But when you've got 20 people doing a row each, you don't know how long a row takes until they finish. Now, all of a sudden, I can say, okay, there's 100 hours, there's 20 rows, that's 5 hours a row after the workers have finished one row. If it took 6 hours, we know we're not on track. He can ring me now and we can say, okay, we can have a look and make it, that's all we can do. That's as good as it gets. Or we could say, this is the problem. This is how we correct it before. But like in the past, we always just got all this data a week later and we're like, we stuffed this up. We stuffed that up. Now we're trying to do everything live and be proactive and give out the goals to the teams. When we send them the task, a row should take you 5 hours with 6 people. Why didn't it? You should have 100 pieces of fruit on a tree. And, and we have one girl just following behind that platform counting trees because there's 6 people on a tree. So we can justify having that. So, it's more made us more strategic rather than just farmers. Like we are more precision-based farming than just, that's what the nature. Sometimes though, nature just gives you what nature gives you. Sometimes you can try and be as precise as you like, but nature dictates what's going to happen. But we try and control what we can control.
And your industry, I mean, as you said earlier on about the amount of labour that's coming onto your place, casual labour, seasonal workers that come in, how much of that issue has an impact on your role and about the HR issue, and also to safety for them? It obviously is a real challenge for your sector.
Yeah. So, I basically feel like I manage managers to manage people. I don't manage trees anymore is kind of the way that I feel. As we have expanded, as I said, we have 4 properties and we potentially moving into others. So now the key decisions that we make are not just all about, did we put this spray on? Did we do this? It's about, right now it's about how do we secure our workforce for in 6 months' time and make sure that we, what can we do to make those people happy? It's coming up with those decisions and that sort of stuff. And then, safety for us, it is a big concern. We have a lot of people. In the past, we would have a lot of tractors, a lot of trailers, so bringing little teams into the thing and getting rid of the ladders, getting rid of the tractors zooming up and down rows. Before, when we had people in 20 rows, we'd have tractors zooming up and down each of those rows picking up bins because it might take them 2 days to pick a row. So we couldn't just leave it and pick it later. Where now when we put 6 people in one row, in 2 hours, that row is finished. So we never have to put a tractor in a row where there's people in a row. We are taking it's all that sort of stuff. But it's all still hard. We haven't fixed the problem. But we are trying to, implement practices to get machinery away from people and just, try and make it as workable as we can.
Graham, listening to Jason, then he sounds like he's on top of his game in relation to how he does safety. Do you find him to be increasingly typical, or is he an anomaly? Are you still seeing? I mean, obviously the stats there about the 2% to 30% of fatalities. Is he what you're seeing nowadays?
Ed, I think it's a mixed bag. What I'd sadly say is that stat of 2% of the workforce, 30% of the deaths has hardly moved in the last 20, 30 years. Whereas if you look at productive output across Victoria in agriculture, that's gone through the roof. So we haven't seen the same level of improvement. But what Jason's talking about, that's spot on. Have a look. There's a risk from tractors. Can I change my system of work so that I can keep the people away from the tractors? He hasn't gone for let's put some alarm bells on the tractors and rely on or just tell people to get out of the way. He's actually changed the system of work, and so that's a best practice model of thinking through a safety risk and how do we manage that. And sadly, we had a fatality earlier this year on a horticultural property with a worker run over by a tractor. So that risk that Jason's talking about, that's real. Someone didn't go home from work earlier this year because they got run over from a tractor on a horticultural enterprise in Victoria. So separating people and vehicles, and particularly when you're talking seasonal workers too, to some degree, You got a whole bunch of people that aren't your workers all the time. So thinking about how you manage them and keep them safe, you've really got to put an extra lens on it. So good farmers, a bit like Cam kicked off, good farmers make good decisions at the right time. Good farmers make good safety decisions at the right time. What we want to do is we want to elevate everyone to that standard.
Cam, do you think that there is a view still that there's a trade-off between productivity and safety?
Trade-off, sometimes it's just another thing on top of what we've got to do. So whether you call that a trade-off, yeah, possibly you could call it that. But for some people, it's just like another impost, and therefore is going to slow down what I need to do. But if you actually take a step back, and Graham said, that one thing I like about the sort of matrix stuff that I do is that they only take 20 minutes, but you stop and think. And there's actually a professor in the US called Daniel Kahneman. He's written lots of really good stuff. And the basic premise of what he says around decision making is that we make decisions too quickly. We need to just slow down our decision making a bit and think about it, and think about some of probably the less obvious things that should be as part of our considerations, rather than just saying, I've always done that, that's what I'll keep doing in the future. So I think I'd put safety into that, right at the top of it. I think that in a lot of the decisions, if you slow down a bit, safety becomes a major one of those critical factors to consider. And the weighting that you put on them all of a sudden becomes very high. So the other things that you thought were more important, when you actually take a step back and think about it, the safety one actually has a very a high value in making that, ultimately making that decision or scoring that decision.
Jason, if we want to go back to your opening talk, the platforms that you talked about, in relation to, what was your motivation? You brought these platforms in that sort of changed the whole way you're doing things. What was the motivation behind doing that?
I think OH&S was the very initial and it wasn't probably the initial motivation behind platforms. Originally, we went to cherry pickers. So we took ladders out of the system. When I say out of the system, 90% out of the system. We still had to every now and then pull a ladder in there. But we brought in just hydro ladder cherry pickers, one person operating machines that did the tops, and we did the bottoms separately. So we sort of went for that just because, and now we still have that example, is now we're really bad at using ladders. So we had a block of apricots that we just held on to for the last few years, but we only picked them for 2 weeks, but we had to, the system wasn't set up for hydro ladder, for cherry pickers. And we'd put people on ladders, and every year we'd just have one person fall off and do an injury. And it was just like, we only make $10,000 out of those apricots, and we pretty much lose $20,000 in an OH&S decision. But as farmers, if we were actually told that if it was going to cost you $10 more a bin to grow that fruit, which it did once the person fell off, we probably would have never grown the fruit, but we just keep taking the chance. Sort of thing. And then in the end we get slapped with a penalty. So that was our initial thing. And then as we got the systems that then we could fit the platforms in, the platforms then took one cherry picker out of the system, and we put 4 people on that. And the machines drive straight rather than having to. So then we started to come into, with a cherry picker, you into the tree, out, forward. Where with the platforms they just forward. So we started to get efficiencies in the movements of the machines. But straight away, it was all originally around efficiency and OH&S. We just didn't want people on ladders. One, because, OH&S, but 2, they're not efficient. If someone's climbing up and down a ladder to pick 4 pieces of fruit and then climb down, you have to have a strong, big, experienced person. Like a really good person on a ladder could probably keep up with a platform, but there isn't the money or the incentive now to have all those really good pickers are gone. So now we've just got normal people, and you put them on a ladder, they pick 1 to 2 bins a day, where we can get to, everyone says, how much do the platforms save you? The cheapest way to save money is to prune off all your fruit. So you don't have to thin, you don't have to pick, and you don't have to think. You won't make any money, but that's the cheapest way to grow fruit. So I say, not how much does it save me? It doesn't save me anything. I probably don't do it any cheaper than you, but I get more money for my fruit. I get a better quality job. I get a better, so it's how much money can that machine make you? It's the return on investment sort of thing. So that's where we went to. And then, our efficiencies went up, with normal people, not relying on, there isn't the old school backpack, old school picker and that anymore. Like, if you're relying on them to come from somewhere, I think you are not, you're behind the times. Like, you have to catch up and work out how you can make your workforce attracted. Like, how can you attract your workforce?
And that's good to see you when you're almost ticking off your decision-making process in front of us as you talk about that. So that's really interesting. Got some questions coming in now. Probably first one will go to you, Graham, and you might want to weigh in, Cam, with this as well. How should a farmer manage stock agents that come and work in their stockyards? Is the farmer responsible if the stock agent is injured?
Yeah, there's a very simple answer to that one, Ed. You are responsible for the health and safety of anyone who comes into your business. So whether that's a stock agent, whether it's a contractor you've employed, whether it's an employee, or whether it's a member of public or a family friend, or if you are responsible for the health and safety of every person who comes into your business.
Yeah, Cam, you see a million times people on farms all the time come and visit.
Yeah, but it's changing, I reckon, Ed. I'd see people where, the cousins had come from Melbourne and we're going to do something in the cattle yards and that'll be a lot of fun. You got all these bloody little kids running around everywhere and you don't see it now. They're just no-go zones, and I remember seeing one in the cattle crush, and the way the arm on the crush worked was it moved sideways rather than down or whatever else, and it painted all this stuff just on the concrete on the ground. Do not walk through there, just basic things like that. And none of the kids were allowed to go into the actual working operation of the yards. They had to stay at a distance, and I'm seeing more and more of that. You're starting to see those things where people are actually realising, when they walk onto the place, it's my responsibility. And what used to be fun to do years ago, the risk now is just not worth it.
This one's sort of across the board for all of you. Is it unsustainable for enterprises to solely bear responsibility for risk? Is there a future where employees should be more accountable for their own safety? Graham, do you want to kick off on that one?
And again, the Act says employees are required to act safely, but the onus is also on an employer to make sure that happens. So you have supervisory responsibility. If you've got staff that aren't behaving in safe ways, aren't acting in safe ways, you as an employer have the responsibility of making sure that they do and guiding them, taking disciplinary action if you need to, but certainly there is a responsibility for an employee not to do unsafe acts as well.
Yeah, Jason, this is probably very pertinent to your enterprise and to your industry about the employees, because you have so many. Do you see with a stage where they need to take more responsibility for things that happen?
I do think they need to take responsibility, but I do think that only needs to take responsibility if they are breaking a law that has been enforced. Like, they shouldn't need to take responsibility, because the classic line that you hear is that's common sense. Nothing is common, mate. I've seen common sense does not exist. Because what someone else thinks is common sense and what you think is common sense is never the same. So I do think if you have got an employee that has, you have been hounding into them that they're doing something wrong or something, and then they've gone and broken, on a fourth time or whatever, I don't know whether we can get out of it, but I think a lot of the times we're not actually enforcing the rule enough to be able to just blame the employee. You can't just blame the employee. You can only potentially blame the employees if they have really, really, really broken the rules. of what, and it's kind of like you haven't seen them do it or something like that. You can't just shut your eyes, say, I seen them do that, and then now that's their fault because they didn't do what I originally said.
And Jason, that's the same. Take an example like bullying, to take it out of a sort of farm scenario but into a general workplace scenario. If we look at who's responsible for bullying behaviour in a workplace, yes, the individual person who's engaging in that bullying, that employee, needs to take responsibility and needs to be dealt with. Who ultimately has responsibility for ensuring that that workplace is safe for the worker who is being bullied or for the organisation? The employer. So the employer has to take action. They have to set the standards, which is kind of what Jason was saying before, and be really clear on those standards. But when employees breach those standards, the employer needs to take action. You can't just turn around and say, well, I told them and they still did it, so it's their fault. No, what were the systems you had in place to make sure that you dealt with breaches and dealt with bad behaviour? With big numbers of employees, that's tough. There's no doubt about that. But that's tough in every industry, in every business that employs lots of people.
But I think if I can just jump in, Ed, what Jason was saying, I think is right. As an employer, you can work towards minimising that risk. Okay, and I think that is incumbent on the employer, and exactly what he was saying about how they've changed the platform from people walking down rows and tractors going there to another system. So I think there is always opportunity, I think, to put systems in place that minimise the chances of something going wrong. And there's also systems you can put in place to make sure people understand what the expectations are and make sure that if, in a sense, that induction, all that refreshing on, come on, you got to do this, got to do that, can be built into systems and built in, not in a threatening way, but just, this is the way we do business type stuff. I think both of those are relevant things for an employer to do. And then if the employee doesn't do that, you can't turn a blind eye to it. They were the systems, they were the behaviours, they were the rules that we set, they're the boundaries that we've set. You're continually doing that. If you keep doing that, then sorry, it's unacceptable. I really think that's probably the best way you can sort of balance that stuff up. But I go onto lots of farms, our farm no different. You're always looking out, how could I do something that would improve or minimise the potential risk? Even though it may never happen, but you think there could be a risk there. How can we do it? I mean, a classic one we've got at home now is we're going to auto drafting for our sheep. Partly because of technology, because we've got the tags in there now. But I tell you what, if you've ever stood on a drafting gate and by the time the 1000th weather is coming down there and you've drafted the wrong way and then one climbs over the back and whacks you in the head, as you're tired and stuff like that, going to some other system that means no one has to stand on the gate and swing it because it's all done electronically, they're the opportunities I reckon in farming that we've got all the time to see where is that new system, that new something we can put in place that would allow us to minimise that risk from a safety point of view. Helps with us in efficiency as well. It's one less person in the yards we need too. So, there's productivity gains in it, but there's certainly an efficiency gain as well.
Another question here, Cam, and this is for you, Cam, and it comes back to your earlier conversation and your point allocation that you put up. It says, how do you go about allocating weightings to your considerations? Were they arbitrary to start with and see how they go, or did you have a process?
Yeah, really good question. There's a process. So the weighting, if you saw on each of those, we had 3 different descriptions. All the worst descriptions in each of those critical factors I set as 0. So if everything was the worst possible outcome for each of those 6 or 7 considerations, the score would be 0. And then I start thinking about the best results in each of those critical factors relative to each other. So and we'll bring it back to a safety one, if you had an example where safety was one of those critical factors you need to consider, and this would greatly reduce safety, you might put a lot of points on that because it has a major impact on your decision. There is a process that I go through. In fact, I'm just in the stages of putting a short video, and we're making this as a simple online tool to be able to create those decision matrices. But yes, there is a process we go through from that relative weighting point of view. Having said that, and I reckon this is an important point that I didn't have time to mention at the start, Ed, was the beauty when you write it down. As soon as you write it down, you share it with other people. You make it transparent and other people can see it. It also allows you to reflect on it if the decision, particularly if it's a recurring one, if the decision hasn't worked out exactly the way you thought. And I remember a farmer, I first saw this from South Australia, and he used to put a lot of weighting on seasonal forecasts when he was deciding how much crop to sow. And he's learnt over the years that the reliability or the skill of those seasonal forecasts in April, May were pretty poor. And so over the years, he's scaled back how much importance, in other words, the scores he gives to that seasonal forecast compared to other things. So you do it, you reflect on the decision, the outcome of it, and you think, at that point in time, what could we have known? We put too much emphasis on this, not enough on that. So we adjust our scores accordingly. And particularly the ones that are recurring, as we say, 6 or 8 of them at home that are recurring every year. When they come out, first thing we do is just reflect on them and say, was this good last year? Did this point us in the right direction? Did this lead to a good decision in hindsight? And if we say, no, it didn't, we got that slightly wrong. What did we get wrong? Oh, we put too much weighting on that, or we hadn't considered this at all. So our matrix then changes and we put another consideration in and put a value on that. So it's sort of an iterative type process. You go through it, you change it again. But yeah, there are steps or a process to go through to come up with those weightings.
Graham, there's a question here for you. In your experience, which decisions lead to the most injuries and deaths on farm?
Oh, goodness, Ed, that's a hard one. Look, I think there's, I think Cam touched on that because there's 2 parts to that. One, he talked about, can you make a decision that actually removes the risk altogether? And they are by far and away the best decisions. So, we're putting people on platforms, getting the tractor out of the row is a much better decision than just telling people, be careful of the tractor, it comes up and down the road. But I'd say that when we look at the fatalities, so that's overlying it always. When we look at the fatalities and what happens, so many of them are really simple little ones made at the time. I took the tractor out up a hilly area to do some spraying. It's got a rollover protection in it, but I didn't put the seatbelt on. And it rolled over. I got thrown out of the tractor and I got crushed by the tractor. So the decision about what sort of tractor to buy, that it had a seatbelt, all of that stuff was done. The big decision, tiny little decision, and bang, you're gone. I'm getting some cattle into the, up to the truck, and the person talked about stock ages there. We're having trouble getting them on. They're not loading. I'm in a bit of a rush. I'll just jump in the yard and hurry them up. And I haven't got any escape routes out of my yards. My yards aren't well designed. Suddenly I'm in there and bang, I get hit by a cranky steer that comes racing back at me and I get killed. And 90% of the deaths on farms are either caused by vehicles, tractors, trucks, quad bikes, or livestock, cattle. So, where are the decisions? If you're focused on those, if farmers focus on those, we reduce the fatalities way down. There's lots of other injuries caused by other things. There are fatalities caused by other things, but just those little decisions, hopping in the yard when you probably shouldn't have, not clipping that seatbelt on. They're just those little ones that seem to be common.
You've raised it, and I'm not going to let you go without talking about this, Graham, but quad bikes, it's been sort of the issue of the last decade. Certainly through the coverage of the Weekly Times, we've seen certainly a shift in the view, but there is certainly still some people who really think that it's an issue that's not related to them. Where are we at with that attitude to quad bikes in the farming sector that you can see? I
think it's moved a lot, And there is generally more acceptance that OPD, operated protection devices, actually do save lives. You might still get injured, but you're less likely to die on a quad bike if you've got an OPD on it. There's no two ways about it. And we were talking the other day about the shift from trikes to quads. We're also seeing, and what a great move that was, because those trikes were shockers. We're also seeing more side-by-sides, more people using side-by-sides instead of quad bikes. And again, you've then got rollover protection. You've got barriers to stop you falling out. You've got seat belts. So I think there's a general move that people are accepting that, they're really useful tools, but they've got to be used carefully, and they've got to be as safe as they possibly can be. And OPDs are part of that. And as most people on the online would know, the ACCC's made a decision that from October next year, all quad bikes that are sold in Australia will have an OPD fitted. And we think that's a great decision, supported by the VFF, supported by most people who are concerned about safety on farms.
Jason, just on that earlier question about the decision that you see, that we asked Graham, that you see that causes the most injuries, are you seeing, what sort of things do you see that will cause an injury in your sector?
I'd say the number one for our sector would be falling off ladders. So not major injury. And then I would say that the major injury one would be like the casual workforce that aren't your full-time worker employees on little tractors during harvest. That's, it's a classic example. Is you'll go to a farm and they will give out every single worker a little tractor, and they think that they maybe save themselves $1 or $2 a bin from having someone going picking them up, and they'll have the picker deliver that bin back to the shed. But I think if you did the sums of, if an accident happened over 5 years, how much would that accident cost you compared to how many bins you picked, and divided that back, you probably would be cheaper off paying one individual person to bring those bins backwards and forwards to the shed. So saying that, if you will go back 15 years ago, we had all those little tractors. We had one girl that her picking bag that's got a little flap, that's got a little hook, flicked over the mudguard and somehow hooked around the tube valve. And when she took off, it pulled her underneath the tractor, and it was just lucky the tractor stalled. Like, it smashed her hip. We had to get but it was just like, that was, and it wasn't just the financial. It was just like, we had that girl here she was from Taiwan. She couldn't get home. Like, she was here for another 6 years. Like, it was terrible, terrible, terrible. Like, she was so lucky. And ever since then, we have really worked away from that system. But you'll, like, all the time I'll go into a farm and I'll see it, and I cringe every time I see it, because it is just a thing waiting to happen to save $1 or $2 a bin. Like, it's not like it's a huge expense on the thing. And by the time you pay to service those little tractors and everything, it's not worth it anyway in the long run.
Yeah, that's a shocking story, but a really good insight into the sort of stuff that does happen out there. We've got about 5 minutes left. Cam, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's an example of a good decision you've made, and reason why, and what was the outcome from it?
Farming. I'm glad my wife's not here, because she'd say getting married, as you would know, Ed. What's a good decision we've made? I think our decision, the way we've set our farm up, we've spent over a number of years long-term capital investment to make sure that we get our land class fencing, our soils, invested in productivity on the farm. So look, a whole lot of things. I don't think there's one I could actually point to directly, but a lot of them are good decisions, and I think they're good decisions because we've thought about them beforehand. And we've weighed up, as I said, those pros and cons. And in the early days, I had no process for it. It's just sort of what we did. Now that we've got a process, I think we even make better decisions around that. But buying blocks of land, we've bought at different times. I do help a lot of clients in some of this decision making, some of them around succession planning, farm expansion, changing enterprise mix, all that sort of stuff. The process applies. A good decision-making process applies, and more times than not, it works out better if you spend that time on it than if you don't.
Yeah, sorry, my mute disappeared. Jason, throwing the same question to you. An example of a good decision that you've made and the consequence.
Yeah, so I think if we go back 10 to 15 years when we changed our system to the way that we thought we were going to grow fruit, hoping that without knowing that, because at first 15 years ago, maybe platforms were, they were in some people's minds, but they weren't there. But it was developing a system with a vision of developing it before the thing has come. So I think, it's only really now that we, in the last 5 years that we've assisted, because the problem in orcharding anyway is we have to order the trees 3 years before they come. So we have to have the vision to order the trees the way we want them. Then it takes us 5 years to get them up into production. So it's from that day one, it's not until 8 years later whether you see whether that is going to work. So I think, moving in the direction we went to with the platforms, and then there was a big emphasis after that on maximizing production. What can we do to who can set the most tonnage records? And we didn't really get in that game. We sort of went, no, let's stay with the things that we think we can do efficiently and not try and compete with who, let's do something that keeps us making money sustainable and we can get the people to do the job. And we're looking at that now. We're looking at a new farm and I got caught up in I reckon if I bring my rows into 2 meters, I can set new records. But if I do that, then I can't use my platforms anymore. I can't, I have to change my system where if I just went and kept my rows wide enough that I can still keep my platforms and still keep my bin trailers and all this the way that it is, so I don't need tractors running up and down with workers, I might pick 70 tonnes and not get the 110 or whatever, but at the end of the day, I still, for the investment, I still make as much money or more. So it's not about who has the records, it's about, return on investment. And being able to have the workers then to come and do it.
Yeah, and could I just jump in there, Ed? Because I reckon that's a classic one where there are pros and cons. On one side, I could make more money. I could produce more trees here, but on the downside, I can't use my platforms. I can't do this. I can't. So you got to balance that up somewhere in between, and to make a good decision to know which way to jump. That's where I think a process like that, which it sounds like what Jason went through, is exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's the theme of it's coming out of all this. It is that weighing up both sides of the story. Graham, we've got about a minute left. I just wanted to probably finish with you. Where do you see this issue of farm safety in a decade from now? So we hit 2030. Everyone's focused in ags, focused on 2030. Is a message about farm safety, where's that going to be? And the 30% statistic, are we still going to be seeing that?
No, absolutely. I think the aim is that everyone should realise that every fatality on a farm is completely preventable. We want to see 0 deaths on farms each year, and that's an absolutely achievable aim by 2030. It's an achievable aim next year, frankly, if people really focus on it. And I think it is changing. I think people are valuing their workers more. They're valuing themselves more. They're more aware of that there really are risks, and it could happen to you, and it will have a big impact on your family and your production and your community if it does. So I think there's a mindset change happening, and we want to help that along. We want to have people have the skills and the knowledge, but 0 deaths on farms is the goal by 2030.
Yeah, I think we're all in agreement that we want to get to. So Cam, Jason, Graham, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to the audience for joining us. It's been a really good discussion. It's fantastic. So finally, we're doing a rural pulse survey throughout VirtuAg and for the next few weeks. So you go to virtuag.com.au. We've got a 12-question poll there, which is sponsored by WorkSafe Victoria. So just to give us a bit of an idea of where we're at. So thanks for joining us. That's where we'll finish up today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Okay.